Ben nodded, his resolve matching hers. If they come back, we'll be ready. We will, Ella agreed. The next morning, Ella received a call from Agent Walker. We've made significant progress thanks to your intel, he said. But there's more work to be done. If you're ever interested in helping us again, the door's open. Ella paused, glancing at Ben, who was packing a backpack for his workshop. Thanks, but I've got my own priorities here. Walker chuckled. Fair enough. Just know you've made some powerful enemies and some grateful allies. Ella ended the call, feeling a sense of closure. That evening, the neighborhood held a block party to celebrate their victory. String lights hung between buildings, music played from portable speakers, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Ella stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the community she had fought for came together in joy and solidarity. Maria approached, handing her a plate of food. You're the reason we're here tonight, you know? Ella shook her head. This was a group effort. Maybe, Maria said, smiling, but you gave us the courage to fight. As the party wound down, Ben pulled Ella toward the center of the street, where neighbors were gathering for a final toast. To Ella Morgan, Tom Bennett declared, raising his glass, for reminding us that even when we're scared, we're stronger together. The crowd cheered, and Ella's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. To all of us, Ella corrected, raising her own glass, for proving that this neighborhood is worth fighting for. The cheers grew louder, echoing through the night. As Ella and Ben walked home, the city lights shimmering in the distance, Ben asked, Do you think we've seen the last of people like Hector? Ella shook her head. There will always be people like Hector. But as long as there are people like us, willing to stand up to them, they'll never win. Ben smiled, slipping his hand into hers. I like the sound of that. Ella squeezed his hand, her heart full. They had fought, they had won, and now they were ready to build something better. Together. Ella Morgan had always found solace in the quiet corners of her small bookstore in Miami. Tucked away on a bustling side street, Morgan's Books and Coffee was a haven for the neighborhood, a place where children searched for their next adventure novel, elderly patrons swapped stories over coffee, and students hunched over tables with textbooks and laptops. For Ella, it was more than a business. It was her retreat from a life she no longer spoke of, one filled with shadows and secrets. Her teenage son, Ben, sprawled across a beanbag in the corner, was engrossed in a thick paperback about investigative journalism. At 16, he had inherited his mother's quiet determination and sharp intellect. He was a curious soul, always asking questions, always searching for stories. Ella had done her best to shield him from the harsher truths of the world, but Ben's insatiable curiosity often put him closer to danger than she liked. Mom, why do you always double-lock the back door? Ben asked, looking up from his book. Ella glanced over from the register, where she was ringing up a customer. Habit, she replied with a small smile. Good habits keep us safe. Ben rolled his eyes, muttering, You're the queen of paranoia. The bell above the front door jingled as Maria Fernandez, the owner of the flower shop next door, walked in. She carried a bouquet of daisies wrapped in brown paper. Her smile was warm, but Ella noticed the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes darted toward the windows. Ella, can I talk to you for a moment? Maria asked, her voice low. Of course. Ella set the register aside and led Maria to the back of the store. Once they were alone, Maria's mask of calm slipped. It's the El Tigre gang, she said, her voice trembling. They came to my shop yesterday. Said they're offering protection. Ella's stomach tightened. She'd heard whispers about El Tigre moving into the area, but this was the first time they'd made their presence known so boldly. What did you tell them? Ella asked. I told them no, Maria said, but they said if I don't change my mind, they'll make an example of me. Ella nodded, her mind already calculating. Don't worry, we'll figure something out. Maria's eyes brimmed with gratitude, but Ella's thoughts were elsewhere. She'd spent years avoiding confrontations like this, blending into the background, playing the role of an ordinary shopkeeper. But El Tigre's arrival threatened more than just Maria. It threatened the entire neighborhood she had come to call home. That evening, after closing up, Ella walked Ben home through the dimly lit streets. The Miami skyline glowed in the distance, but the neighborhood felt heavy with unease. "Mom, you okay?" Ben asked, noticing her silence. Ella smiled down at him. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a lot on my mind." At home, Ella checked the locks on the doors and windows before heading into the basement. It was a room Ben had rarely seen, filled with old storage boxes and forgotten furniture. But in one corner, hidden behind a shelf of dusty books, was a locked metal cabinet. Ella pulled out a key from her pocket, unlocked the cabinet, and opened it. Inside were relics of a life she had left behind: a disassembled sniper rifle, a handful of medals, and a folder stamped with the words "Classified." At the bottom was a small badge with her codename etched into the metal: Wraith. She traced the badge with her fingers, her mind drifting back to a different time. She had been one of the CIA's top field operatives, dismantling drug cartels, dismantling terror cells, and vanishing before anyone knew she was there. But that life had cost her dearly, and when Ben was born, she'd vowed to leave it behind for good. Now, as she stared at the remnants of her past, Ella felt a familiar tension in her chest. She had tried to bury Wraith, to become Ella Morgan, a simple bookstore owner. But it seemed the shadows of her old life were creeping back. The next morning, Ella arrived at the shop early to repair the damage from the night before. The window displays were pristine by the time Ben joined her after school, but her calm facade was tested when Hector Ruiz, the leader of El Tigre, swaggered into the store with two of his men. Hector was a tall man with slicked back hair and a gold chain glinting around his neck. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Morgan, right?" he asked, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I'm Hector Ruiz. I hear you're the pillar of this little community." "I run a bookstore," Ella replied evenly. "Exactly," Hector said. "And businesses like yours benefit from a safe neighborhood. That's where my crew comes in. For a small fee, we keep things orderly." Ella's eyes narrowed. "Orderly?" Hector stepped closer, his smile fading. "You've got a nice place here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it." Ella met his gaze without flinching. "We don't need your kind of help. I suggest you leave." Hector chuckled, glancing at his men. "I like her spirit. You've got until Friday to reconsider." He turned and strolled out, leaving Ella standing in the quiet tension of the store. Ben watched from behind the counter, his eyes wide. "Who was that?" he asked. Ella took a deep breath. "Someone we're not going to deal with." As the sun set over Miami, Ella sat on the front steps of the bookstore, her mind racing. She had spent years trying to outrun her past, but it seemed destiny had other plans. For the first time in over a decade, she felt the familiar stirrings of the Wraith, the ghost she had tried to bury. Ella Morgan wasn't just a mother or a shopkeeper. She was something far more dangerous. And El Tigre was about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. Ella Morgan was no stranger to threats, but something about Hector Ruiz's visit unsettled her more than she let on. She had faced men like him before, bullies who thought fear was power, but this time was different. This wasn't a covert mission in a foreign land. This was her neighborhood, her son, her life. The next morning, Ella arrived at her bookstore early, surveying the damage from the previous night. Her windows had been smashed, and a crude message spray-painted on the wall read, "Pay or regret it." Maria, the florist, was already outside, her face pale with worry. "Ella, I'm so sorry. They hit your shop too?" Ella nodded, brushing glass into a dustpan. "They're sending a message. Should we call the police?" Maria asked hesitantly. Ella considered it, but shook her head. "We both know they won't do much. Hector's people probably have connections inside the department." Maria's shoulders slumped, and she glanced nervously at the street. "What are we going to do?" Ella placed a reassuring hand on Maria's arm. "Don't worry. I'll figure something out." But even as she said it, Ella knew this was more than just a neighborhood squabble. Hector's gang wasn't the usual group of petty criminals. Their methods were too organized, their threats too calculated. Later that evening, Ben returned from school to find Ella unusually quiet. "Hey, Mom," he said, dropping his backpack by the door. "What's going on? You seem off." Ella hesitated, not wanting to burden him, but she knew Ben was sharp. Keeping him in the dark wouldn't work for long. Some people in the neighborhood are causing trouble, she said, keeping her tone light. Ben frowned. Like those guys who came to the shop yesterday? Ella's eyes flicked to him. You saw them? Yeah, Ben replied, crossing his arms. Who are they? Ella paused, considering how much to reveal. They're part of a gang. They've been trying to intimidate local businesses. And what are you going to do about it? Ben asked, his tone both curious and worried. Ella smiled faintly. I'll handle it. But Ben wasn't convinced. That night, as Ella cleaned up the shop, Ben decided to investigate on his own. The next day, Ben skipped his usual after-school hangout to follow a lead. He'd overheard some classmates talking about El Tigre's activity near the docks. With his phone tucked into his jacket, Ben biked across town, arriving at a rundown warehouse. From the shadows, he saw men unloading crates from trucks, their movements efficient and deliberate. Ben crept closer, hiding behind a stack of pallets. Using his phone, he snapped pictures of the crates, zooming in on the labels, military-grade weapons. Suddenly, a hand clamped on his shoulder. Ben spun around to see a burly man glaring at him. What do we have here? Ella was locking up the bookstore when she noticed Ben hadn't come home. She checked her phone and found no messages. Her worry deepened into alarm. Her instincts kicked in, the part of her she had buried for years. Heading to the basement, she opened the cabinet where her old gear was stored. She pulled out a tactical vest, a compact pistol, and a knife. Meanwhile, Ben was being dragged into the warehouse by two of Hector's men. They shoved him into a chair, tying his wrists. Hector strolled into the room, his gold chain catching the dim light. Well, well, Hector said, smiling. The curious little reporter. You know, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong can be dangerous. I didn't see anything, Ben lied, trying to keep his voice steady. Hector chuckled. Smart kid, but not smart enough. As Hector turned to instruct his men, a faint sound echoed through the warehouse. A soft thud, followed by the muffled groan of one of his guards. Hector froze, his smile fading. What was that? Before anyone could answer, the lights went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. Ella moved like a shadow, her steps silent on the concrete floor. She had disabled the power and neutralized two guards at the perimeter. Now, she had to find Ben. Using her night vision goggles, Ella scanned the warehouse. She spotted Ben tied to a chair, flanked by Hector and two armed men. Ella calculated her approach. She pulled a flashbang grenade from her belt, activated it, and tossed it into the room. The explosion of light and sound disoriented Hector and his men. Ella rushed in, disarming one of the guards with a swift strike to his wrist. She used the butt of her pistol to knock him out before turning to the second guard, who was fumbling with his weapon. A precise kick to his chest sent him sprawling. Hector, recovering from the flashbang, grabbed Ben and pulled a knife to his throat. Stay back, Hector shouted, his bravado cracking. Ella raised her pistol, aiming it directly at Hector's head. Let him go. Or what? Hector sneered. You'll shoot? You don't have the guts. Ella's expression didn't change. You don't know me. The coldness in her voice made Hector hesitate. Taking advantage of his momentary distraction, Ben slammed his head backward, hitting Hector's nose. Hector stumbled, releasing Ben, and Ella closed the distance in an instant. She twisted Hector's arm, forcing him to drop the knife, and shoved him to the ground. Ben scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. Mom, he whispered. Ella didn't answer immediately. She zip-tied Hector's hands and turned to Ben. Are you hurt? Ben shook his head. No, but what was that? How did you? We'll talk later, Ella interrupted. Right now, we need to go. They returned home under the cover of darkness. Ben sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. Mom, you need to tell me what's going on, he said. Ella sighed, sitting across from him. Before you were born, I worked for the CIA. My job was to dismantle dangerous organizations, including cartels like El Tigre. Ben stared at her, speechless. I left that life behind to protect you, Ella continued. But it seems like my past is catching up with us. Are they going to come after us now? Ben asked, his voice shaky. Ella reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his. They might, but I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you. The determination in her voice left no room for doubt. As Ben went to bed that night, Ella stayed up, cleaning her gear and preparing for the battles she knew were coming. The Wraith was back, and this time, she wasn't fighting for a mission. She was fighting for her family. Diego Montoya leaned back in his chair, the dim light of the motel room casting sharp shadows across his scarred face. A cigar smoldered between his fingers as he flipped through a dossier of photographs and reports. Most were of Ella Morgan, candid shots outside her bookstore, blurry images of her in action at the warehouse, and a classified CIA file stamped with her codename, Wraith. Interesting, Diego muttered, his voice low and gravelly. He had hunted ghosts before, but this one was different. She had vanished from the intelligence world over a decade ago. Now, she was resurfacing, dangerously so. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of Hector Ruiz's men entered, his expression anxious. Boss says she's a problem. Wants her gone. Diego smiled coldly. Then she's already dead. She just doesn't know it yet. Ella sat at the counter of her bookstore, her eyes scanning the street through the front window. It was quiet, but too quiet. The kind of quiet that set her nerves on edge. After the incident at the warehouse, she knew Hector wouldn't back down. Ben sat in a corner with his laptop, reviewing the photos he had taken. Mom, I think I found something, he said, breaking the silence. Ella walked over, peering at the screen. Ben had enhanced one of the images from the warehouse, zooming in on a crate label. It wasn't just a random shipment of weapons. It was military-grade hardware, likely stolen or smuggled in from overseas. This isn't just about controlling the neighborhood, Ella murmured. Hector's running a larger operation. These weapons could destabilize the whole city. What do we do? Ben asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Ella's jaw tightened. We gather evidence and shut it down. But first, we need to stay one step ahead of whoever they send after us. That evening, Diego began his surveillance. He watched Ella from a parked car across the street, noting her routines, her habits, and her blind spots. But Ella wasn't an easy target. At the same time, Ella was scanning her surroundings. She spotted the car after its third pass down the block. She noted its out-of-state plates, the driver's military posture, and the way he tried too hard to look inconspicuous. That night, she doubled back on her usual route home, taking alleyways and side streets. She spotted Diego following her, keeping a careful distance. He's good, Ella muttered to herself, but not good enough. The next day, Diego made his move. Under the guise of a delivery man, he entered the bookstore, a box in hand. Package for Ella Morgan, he said with a polite smile. Ella glanced at the label. There was no return address. She recognized the trap immediately. Thanks, she said, taking the box with calm precision. Let me grab my wallet for a tip. As she turned her back, Diego reached into his jacket, but before he could act, Ella spun around, her pistol aimed at his chest. Drop it, she said coldly. Diego smirked, raising his hands. You're good, Wraith, but you won't shoot me here. Not in front of your kid. Ella's eyes flicked to Ben, who was frozen behind the counter. The hesitation was enough. Diego kicked the counter, knocking over a display shelf as a distraction. By the time Ella cleared the debris, he was gone. That night, Ella and Ben sat at the kitchen table, tension hanging thick in the air. Who was that guy? Ben asked. A professional, Ella replied. His name is Diego Montoya. He's a mercenary, ex-special forces. Hector brought him in to eliminate me. Ben swallowed hard. What do we do now? Ella gave him a reassuring look. We don't wait for him to come to us. We take the fight to him. The next morning, Ella began her counter-surveillance. She traced Diego's movements, noting his patterns and weak points. She used the skills that had once made her an elite operative, blending into the crowd, watching from shadows. She followed him to a motel on the outskirts of town. From a vantage point across the street, she watched as Diego met with Hector and his men. Their discussion was heated, but Ella didn't need to hear their words. She knew they were planning their next move. That evening, Diego decided to test her defenses. He approached Ella's house, moving silently through the yard. He bypassed the locks on the back door with practiced ease. But Ella had anticipated this. The moment Diego stepped inside, a tripwire activated, triggering a deafening alarm. Ella appeared at the top of the stairs, a shotgun aimed at him. "Game's over," she said. Diego raised his hands, his expression calm. "Not bad. But you know this won't end here." Ella motioned for him to move. "Get out. Next time, I won't be so generous." Diego smirked as he backed out of the house. "You're making this fun, Wraith, but you can't protect everyone. Sooner or later, you'll slip." Ella didn't lower her weapon until Diego was out of sight. As the night wore on, Ella sat in the living room, cleaning her weapons and reinforcing her defenses. Ben watched from the doorway, his expression a mix of fear and admiration. "Mom," he said softly, "are we going to be okay?" Ella looked at him, her face softening. "Yes, Ben, but we need to be smart. These people only understand power, and we're going to show them we're not afraid." Ben nodded, his determination matching hers. As the clock struck midnight, Ella's phone buzzed. It was a text from Maria. "Hector's men are targeting the flower shop tonight. Please help." Ella grabbed her gear and headed for the door. The Wraith was fully awake now, and she was ready to hunt. The streets of Miami were eerily quiet as Ella parked her car 2 blocks from Maria's flower shop. The darkness was her ally, and she moved through it with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years mastering it. The flower shop stood on the corner of a narrow street, its cheery sign now a sad reminder of simpler times. Through the window, Ella spotted 2 of Hector's men rifling through Maria's inventory. They weren't just searching. They were leaving destruction in their wake, tipping over shelves and shattering vases. Ella crept closer, her senses heightened. She spotted a third man standing outside, smoking and scanning the street. His posture was sloppy, his movements slow. He wasn't expecting resistance. She took him down first, a silent strike to the back of his neck, rendering him unconscious. Dragging him into the shadows, she zip-tied his hands and moved toward the shop's back entrance. Inside, Maria and her teenage daughter, Sophia, huddled behind the counter. Sophia clutched her mother tightly, trying to muffle her sobs. "Please, we don't have any money," Maria begged, her voice shaking. One of the men sneered. "It's not about money anymore, lady. It's about respect. You should have taken the deal." The other thug smashed a potted plant on the ground, laughing cruelly. "Hector says hi." A faint sound from the back made them both freeze. "Did you hear that?" Before they could react, Ella stepped into the room, her pistol aimed steadily. "Drop it," she commanded. One of the men raised a crowbar, but Ella fired a single warning shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the small space, and both men froze. "I said, drop it." They complied, raising their hands. "Out. Now." Ella gestured with her pistol. The men exchanged nervous glances, but didn't argue. As they shuffled toward the door, Ella followed, her eyes never leaving them. "Tell Hector this neighborhood isn't his," she said coldly. "And if he sends anyone else, they won't walk away." As dawn broke over Miami, the news of the incident at the flower shop spread quickly. Local business owners began whispering about how Ella had stood up to Hector's men. Some felt inspired. Others feared it would only bring more trouble. Ella met with Arthur Hayes, the sheriff, in a quiet diner on the edge of town. Arthur was a grizzled veteran of the force, his face lined with years of frustration at a system that often worked against him. "You're making waves, Ella," Arthur said, stirring his coffee. "Someone has to," Ella replied. Arthur leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Hector's not going to let this slide. He's too proud. And now he's got half the city council in his pocket. My hands are tied." Ella's jaw tightened. "Then untie them. You know what he's doing. Intimidating, extorting, and now smuggling weapons. Are you really going to stand by and watch?" Arthur sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I want to help, but I've got corrupt officers on my payroll, city officials breathing down my neck, and a family to protect." Ella met his gaze, her voice firm. "We're all protecting someone, Arthur. But if we let people like Hector take over, there won't be anything left to protect." Arthur nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "All right. What do you need?" That evening, Ella gathered the community's business owners at the bookstore. Maria, the Bennetts from the bakery, and the Rosarios from the corner grocery all crowded into the back room, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Ella addressed them with quiet authority. Hector thinks he can intimidate us into submission. He's counting on fear to keep us divided. But we're stronger together. Stronger? Tom Bennett, the burly baker, scoffed. He's got guns, money, and half the cops in his pocket. What do we have? Each other, Ella replied. And me. The room fell silent. I know how these people think, how they operate. If we work together, we can push back. But I need your trust and your help. Maria spoke up, her voice shaky but resolute. Ella saved me and Sophia last night. If she says we can fight, I'm with her. One by one, the others nodded, their fear slowly giving way to determination. Meanwhile, Diego Montoya was watching. From a darkened car parked down the street, he observed the meeting through binoculars. She's rallying them, Diego muttered into his phone. She's not just defending herself. She's building an army. On the other end of the line, Hector growled. Then take her out. Tonight. Diego smirked. Patience. Wraith isn't someone you rush. I'll take her when she doesn't see it coming. As the community meeting dispersed, Ella walked Ben home under the cover of darkness. Mom, Ben said hesitantly, do you really think we can stop them? Ella looked at him, her expression serious. I don't know, but I know we can't let them win. That night, as Ben slept, Ella went to the basement. She opened her secure cabinet and pulled out an old tactical vest, a knife, and a small comms device. The Wraith was back, and this time, she wasn't just fighting for her survival. She was fighting for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. But as Ella prepared for war, Diego was already closing in. In the dead of night, he entered the flower shop, searching for clues. He found a hidden security camera and pulled the footage, watching as Ella dismantled Hector's men with surgical precision. A cold smile spread across his face. You're good, Wraith, but you're not untouchable. As Diego left, the camera's red light blinked back to life. What he didn't know was that Ella had already anticipated his moves. She was hunting him, too. Ella woke before dawn, her senses sharp as she prepared for the day. The streets outside were quiet, but she knew the calm wouldn't last. El Tigre wasn't retreating. They were regrouping. At breakfast, Ben joined her at the table, his laptop open and a determined look on his face. I've been doing some research, Ben said, pushing the laptop toward her. Ella raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I hacked into one of their communications hubs, he said, his voice lowering as if someone might overhear. Hector's crew is moving weapons tonight, down at the Southside docks. It's big, Mom, military-grade stuff. If they get it into the city, we're done. Ella's lips thinned, a mix of pride and worry crossing her face. Ben, hacking a criminal network isn't just dangerous, it's reckless. I had to, Ben shot back. They're tearing apart this neighborhood, and you can't do it all alone. Ella studied him, her son who had inherited her stubbornness and sharp instincts. She sighed. Show me what you've got. Ben's research was meticulous. He'd mapped out Hector's supply routes, identified key players involved in the operation, and even pinpointed the exact dock where the shipment would arrive. They're using Dock 17, Ben explained, pointing to a satellite image. There's limited security, but Hector's guys will be there, armed. This shipment is their top priority. Ella nodded. If we can intercept it, we cripple their operation. And then what? Ben asked. Ella hesitated for a moment. Then we make sure they never try this again. That evening, Ella dropped Ben off at Maria's house, insisting he stay out of danger. You can't keep me out of this forever, Ben protested. For now, I can, Ella said firmly. Stay with Maria and Sophia. Keep an eye on them. Ben reluctantly agreed, but as Ella disappeared into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed him. At the docks, Ella blended into the shadows, her gear secured and her mind focused. From her vantage point atop a stack of shipping containers, she observed Hector's men unloading crates from a truck. There were 5 of them, all armed, but their movements were careless. They didn't expect anyone to challenge them. Ella took a deep breath, counting the seconds until she made her move. But before she could act, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A black SUV rolled up to the dock, and Diego Montoya stepped out, his presence commanding instant respect. "Check everything," Diego barked at Hector's men. "I don't want any mistakes." Ella's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a routine shipment. Diego's involvement meant this was critical to Hector's operation. Meanwhile, Ben was pacing in Maria's living room, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit there. He opened his laptop, accessing the security cameras he'd hacked near the docks. Through the grainy footage, he spotted Ella perched atop the containers. He also saw Diego and Hector's men below. "She's outnumbered," Ben muttered to himself. Without thinking, he grabbed his bike and pedaled toward the docks. Ella launched her attack with precision. She disabled the first guard with a swift strike to the back of his neck, then slipped into the shadows as the others turned, confused. The second and third guards went down just as quickly, their weapons kicked away before they could react. Diego noticed the commotion and shouted, "Spread out! Find her!" Ella smirked from her hiding spot. They were playing right into her hands. Ben arrived at the edge of the docks, hiding behind a stack of crates. He spotted Ella moving through the chaos, systematically taking down Hector's men. But then he saw something she didn't. One of the guards had circled behind her, raising his weapon. "Mom!" Ben shouted, his voice cutting through the night. Ella turned just in time, ducking as the guard fired a shot that narrowly missed her. She rolled forward, disarming him with a well-placed kick, and knocked him unconscious. "What are you doing here?" Ella hissed as Ben ran toward her. "Saving you," Ben replied, his voice defiant. Ella didn't have time to argue. "Stay close and stay quiet. If I tell you to run, you run." Diego's men regrouped, realizing they were dealing with more than just a simple ambush. "She's not alone," Diego said, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "Find them both." Ella and Ben moved through the maze of containers, her instincts on high alert. They reached the main shipment, a series of crates marked with military insignias. "Can you open these?" Ella asked. Ben nodded, pulling a small tool from his pocket. "Give me a minute." As Ben worked, Ella kept watch, her grip tight on her weapon. When the crates finally opened, her suspicions were confirmed. Inside were rifles, ammunition, and explosives, enough to arm a small army. "This is bigger than we thought," Ben whispered. "We're shutting it down," Ella replied. Diego's voice echoed through the docks. "Wraith, you think you can stop this? You're out of your league." Ella smirked, her voice steady. "Come and find me." The cat-and-mouse game intensified as Diego and his men closed in. Ella set small traps along the way, tripwires and noisemakers, to slow them down. At one point, Ben froze as a guard walked past their hiding spot, but Ella placed a calming hand on his shoulder, signaling for him to stay still. When the guard moved on, Ben whispered, "How do you do this?" "Years of practice," Ella replied, her voice barely audible. The final confrontation came as Diego cornered them near the water's edge. "You've caused enough trouble," Diego said, his pistol aimed at Ella. "Drop your weapon." Ella hesitated, glancing at Ben. "Do it," Diego growled. Ella lowered her weapon, but as Diego approached, Ben shouted, "Now." Ella moved in a blur, grabbing a hidden knife from her boot and disarming Diego in one swift motion. The two engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their skills evenly matched. Ben, meanwhile, used a crowbar to smash open another crate, pulling out a flare gun. "Mom, duck," he shouted. Ella dropped as Ben fired the flare, hitting a stack of explosives. The resulting explosion sent Diego and his men scrambling. Ella grabbed Ben, pulling him toward the water. "Go. Now." They swam to safety as the fire spread, consuming the shipment. From a distance, Ella watched as Diego and the remaining guards fled. "You did good," Ella said, pulling Ben into a hug. Ben grinned. "Guess I've got some of your instincts." Ella ruffled his hair. "Let's get home." The dock's destruction was on the news the next morning, but there was no mention of Ella or Ben. Hector, however, was furious. "Diego," Hector growled, slamming a hand on the table. "Finish this, now." Diego nodded, his expression dark. "She won't escape again." Ella knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt hope. She and Ben were a team now, and together, they would face whatever came next. Diego Montoya had never failed a contract. For over a decade, he had built his reputation on being efficient, ruthless, and unstoppable. Yet now, standing in the ruins of Dock 17 with Hector Ruiz screaming in his ear, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. "You said she was just another operator," Hector snarled, pacing furiously. "She's tearing us apart piece by piece." "She's more than that," Diego replied, his voice calm despite the tension. "Ella Morgan isn't just an operator. She's Wraith, one of the most lethal assets the CIA ever produced." Hector froze, narrowing his eyes. "Then why is she still alive?" Diego took a slow breath. "Because she's smarter than I expected. But that ends tonight." Ella knew the docks were only a temporary victory. Hector and Diego wouldn't take the loss lightly, and their retaliation would be swift. Sitting at her kitchen table, she traced the maps Ben had pulled from Hector's communications, her mind racing through scenarios. El Tigre had more shipments scheduled, more resources, and now, Diego was undoubtedly planning his next move. Ben sat across from her, his laptop open. "They're scrambling," he said. "All their communications are panicked. They're trying to regroup, but it's a mess." "Good," Ella said, though her tone was wary. "Desperation makes them sloppy, but it also makes them dangerous." Her phone buzzed. Maria's name flashed on the screen. "Ella." Maria's voice trembled. "They've been watching my shop. I saw them outside this morning. Pack what you can and get to the safe house," Ella instructed. "Take Sophia. Don't wait." Maria hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll handle it." By sunset, Ella had already begun laying her trap. She knew Diego would come for her, and he'd bring reinforcements. The only way to stop them was to draw them in on her terms. The bookstore became her battleground. She reinforced the back door with metal braces, secured the windows, and rigged tripwires at every possible entrance. Upstairs, she placed a cache of non-lethal weapons, smoke grenades, flashbangs, and zip ties. She didn't want a bloodbath. She wanted to send a message. Ben watched silently as she worked, his admiration mixed with concern. "Do you think this will work?" he asked. "It has to," Ella replied, her voice firm. "If we wait for them to make the first move, we lose. This way, we stay in control." Ben nodded, though his hands fidgeted. "What if something goes wrong?" Ella paused, meeting his eyes. "Then you stick to the plan. You know the escape routes, the safe houses. If anything happens to me—" "Stop," Ben interrupted, his voice shaking. "Don't say that." Ella softened, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Ben. Together." Nightfall came, and with it, the unmistakable hum of engines. From the upstairs window, Ella spotted two SUVs pulling up across the street. "They're here," she murmured. Ben peered out cautiously. "How many?" "Too many," Ella said grimly. "Stay upstairs. Don't come down unless I call for you." Ben hesitated but obeyed, retreating to the attic with a walkie-talkie in hand. Ella took a deep breath, her nerves steady as she positioned herself near the front door. The first move was theirs. She'd planned for it. The silence outside broke with a crash as the front window shattered. A flashbang grenade rolled across the floor, detonating with a deafening roar. But Ella was ready. She had already retreated to a safe position, unaffected by the flash. As the first two men stormed inside, she triggered the tripwire near the counter, sending a shelf toppling onto them. Another man entered from the back, his footsteps heavy. Ella intercepted him with a swift strike to his knee, disarming him before he could shout. "Three down," she muttered to herself, dragging the unconscious man into the corner. Diego entered last, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos. He barked orders to his men, who spread out through the store. "She's here," he called. "Stay sharp. She's not playing games." Ella smirked from her hiding spot. "Neither am I," she whispered. She tossed a smoke grenade into the center of the room, filling the space with thick gray clouds. The men coughed and stumbled, their visibility reduced to nothing. Ella moved like a shadow, taking them down one by one. A precise strike here, a disarmament there. Her movements were calculated, efficient. Diego watched, impressed despite himself. He had underestimated her once, but he wouldn't do so again. Upstairs, Ben monitored the situation through the security cameras Ella had set up. He saw Diego moving toward the stairs and grabbed his walkie-talkie. "Mom, he's coming up," Ben warned. "Stay put," Ella replied. Diego climbed the stairs slowly, his weapon drawn. He knew Ella wouldn't leave her son undefended, and he intended to exploit that. But as he reached the landing, a loud click stopped him in his tracks. He looked down to see a tripwire stretched across the floor. Before he could react, a small device triggered, releasing a burst of blinding light. Diego stumbled back, disoriented, and Ella appeared, her pistol aimed at his chest. "Game over, Montoya," she said. Diego chuckled, raising his hands. "You're good, Wraith, but this isn't over." "We'll see," Ella replied, zip-tying his hands. By dawn, the remaining attackers had been subdued. Ella called Arthur Hayes, the sheriff, who arrived with a small team of trustworthy deputies to arrest them. Diego, sitting in the back of a squad car, smirked as Ella approached. "You've made your point," he said, "but Hector won't stop, and neither will I." Ella leaned in, her voice low and deadly. "Then you'd better pray I don't catch you again." Diego's smile faltered as the car door slammed shut. Back inside, Ben sat on the couch, his face pale but his eyes bright with relief. "You okay?" Ella asked, sitting beside him. Ben nodded. "Yeah, but what now?" Ella looked out the window, her expression resolute. "Now, we take the fight to them." The morning sun crept over the Miami skyline, casting long shadows across a city on edge. For Ella Morgan, the brief quiet was deceptive. The storm was far from over. Sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, she reviewed the notes and maps Ben had compiled. The events of the previous night had shifted the dynamic. Diego was in custody, but Hector remained a looming threat, now desperate to regain control. "You think Hector will make a move soon?" Ben asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "He doesn't have a choice," Ella replied, scanning the map of Hector's known assets. "We disrupted his operation, embarrassed him, and took his best man out of play. He's going to escalate." Ben frowned, leaning over the map. "So what's his next step?" Ella's jaw tightened. "He goes big. Hector will try to reassert control and send a message, something public, something loud." Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Arthur Hayes, the sheriff. "You need to see this," Arthur said without preamble. At the sheriff's office, Arthur pulled Ella into his office and shut the door. A map of Miami covered the wall, dotted with red pins. "Hector's crew is moving," Arthur said, pointing to a series of locations on the map. "We've had reports of activity at abandoned warehouses, shipping yards, even a few residential neighborhoods. He's consolidating power." Ella studied the map, her tactical mind piecing together the patterns. "These aren't just random moves. He's securing infrastructure, supply chains, safe houses, transport hubs. He's gearing up for something bigger." Arthur nodded grimly. "And that's not all." He handed her a file containing surveillance photos. Ella's heart sank as she flipped through the images. Hector wasn't just regrouping. He was gathering heavy weaponry. One photo showed a crate of explosives being loaded onto a truck. Another showed a blueprint for a city council building. "He's planning an attack," Ella murmured. "A big one." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've got my hands tied. Half my department's still on Hector's payroll, and the other half's too scared to act. We're running out of time." Ella closed the file, her expression hardening. "Then we'll handle it ourselves." Back at the bookstore, Ella shared the intel with Ben. His eyes widened as he scanned the photos. "This is bad," he said. "If Hector pulls this off—" "He won't," Ella interrupted. "We're going to stop him." Ben hesitated, then asked, "How?" Ella gestured to the map on the table. "We hit his infrastructure, take out his safe houses, disrupt his supply chains, and cut him off at the knees. Without his resources, he can't execute his plan." Ben nodded, determination replacing his fear. "What's the first target?" Ella pointed to a warehouse on the map. "Here. It's where they're storing the explosives." If we take it out, we cripple his operation. That night, Ella and Ben prepared for the mission. Ben insisted on joining her, arguing that he could handle himself. Reluctantly, Ella agreed, knowing they were stronger as a team. The warehouse was on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind a chain-link fence and surrounded by overgrown weeds. Through binoculars, Ella counted 4 guards patrolling the perimeter. "Standard rotation," she whispered to Ben. "They're not expecting an attack." Ben nodded, his grip tight on the small toolkit he'd brought. Ella led the way, moving silently through the shadows. They reached the fence, and Ben quickly cut through it with a pair of wire cutters. Inside, they moved toward the building, avoiding the guards. Ella signaled for Ben to stay put while she approached one of the guards from behind, taking him down with a swift, silent strike. She motioned for Ben to follow, and they entered the warehouse. The interior was a maze of crates and equipment. Ben used his phone to take pictures of the labels: military-grade explosives, detonators, and ammunition. "This is enough to level half the city," he whispered. Ella nodded grimly. "That's why we're here." They moved to the center of the warehouse, where a set of large crates were marked with warning symbols. Ella began planting small, timed charges around the area. 5 minutes, she said, handing Ben a detonator. "When I give the signal, you press this." Ben's eyes widened. "Wait, you're leaving me here?" Ella shook her head. "No, we're both getting out. But if something happens, you finish the job." Before they could leave, the sound of voices echoed through the warehouse. Ella pulled Ben into the shadows as Hector himself entered, flanked by armed men. "This is it," Hector said, gesturing to the crates. "Everything we need to remind this city who's in charge." One of his men hesitated. "But what about Wraith? She's taken out Diego, disrupted our shipments." Hector cut him off. "She's just one person. We have an army. And tonight, we end this." Ella clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on her weapon. She whispered to Ben, "Stay here. Don't move." She moved like a shadow, circling around Hector's men. One by one, she neutralized them, her strikes silent and precise. But Hector wasn't a fool. He noticed the shift in the room and shouted, "She's here. Find her." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Hector's men fanned out, searching for Ella, but she used the confusion to her advantage, taking them down systematically. Ben watched from the shadows, clutching the detonator. His heart pounded as a guard passed dangerously close, but he remained still, just as Ella had taught him. Finally, Ella confronted Hector. He raised a pistol, but she disarmed him with a swift kick, sending the weapon skidding across the floor. "You should have stayed out of this," Hector growled, lunging at her. Ella sidestepped, using his momentum against him. She pinned him to the ground, her voice cold. "This is my neighborhood. You don't get to take it." Hector smirked despite the pain. "You think this changes anything? You can't stop us all." Ella glanced at Ben, who was watching from the corner. She gave a subtle nod. "Now!" she shouted. Ben pressed the detonator, and the charges detonated in a series of controlled explosions. The crates ignited, sending flames racing through the warehouse. Ella dragged Hector to his feet, shoving him toward the exit. "Run or burn," she said. Outside, Ella and Ben watched as the warehouse burned, the flames lighting up the night sky. "You did good," Ella said, placing a hand on Ben's shoulder. Ben managed a small smile. "I learned from the best." But Ella's relief was short-lived. She knew this was only the beginning. Hector's plan might be crippled, but he wasn't done, and neither was she. As the sirens of approaching fire trucks filled the air, Ella made a silent vow. She would stop Hector, no matter the cost. The warehouse fire spread its fiery glow across the Miami skyline, a beacon of defiance against Hector Ruiz's growing empire. While Ella Morgan and her son, Ben, escaped the scene undetected, Hector stood in the ashes of his operation, his face a mask of fury. "She's just one woman," Hector roared, kicking a smoldering crate. "And she's tearing everything apart." A trembling underling approached cautiously. "It's not just her, boss. The community, people are standing up. They're fighting back." Hector's rage turned icy, his voice low and venomous. "Then we remind them who owns this city." He turned to his remaining enforcers. Mobilize everyone. Lock down the neighborhood. No one gets in or out without my say-so. And bring me Wraith. I don't care if she's breathing or not. Ella returned to the bookstore, her steps silent but purposeful. The adrenaline of the mission still coursed through her veins, but she knew there was no time to rest. Ben was already at the table, spreading out the intel they'd gathered from the warehouse. We hurt him, he said, but he's not stopping. No, Ella agreed, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. We've cornered him, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. She leaned over the table, studying the map of Hector's known assets. This is his last play. He'll come at us hard and fast, with everything he's got. If we're not ready, people will die. Ben frowned, his determination hardening. Then we make sure we're ready. The next morning, Ella met with Sheriff Arthur Hayes in a secluded spot outside the city. Arthur had been working behind the scenes, quietly rallying the few officers he could trust. We're seeing a major uptick in movement, Arthur said, handing Ella a folder. Hector's locking down the streets, cutting off escape routes. He's setting up a perimeter. Ella opened the folder, scanning the reports. He's trying to isolate us. He thinks fear will break us. Arthur nodded. He's also bringing in reinforcements, professionals from out of town. This isn't just about control anymore. It's a war. Ella looked up, her eyes steely. Then we fight like it's one. Back in the neighborhood, Ella and Ben worked to organize the community. Maria, the florist, and Tom Bennett, the baker, joined Ella in rallying local businesses and residents. We can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy us, Ella told the group. If we stand together, we can protect what's ours. Tom crossed his arms, his face skeptical. And what happens when they show up with guns? You think we can fight that? Ella met his gaze steadily. We don't fight them head-on. We outthink them. We use what we have: numbers, knowledge of the neighborhood, and most importantly, each other. Maria stepped forward, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. I've seen Ella in action. If she says we can do this, I believe her. One by one, the others nodded, their fear giving way to resolve. As the sun set, the neighborhood transformed into a fortress. Residents barricaded streets, set up lookout points, and rigged traps in strategic locations. Ella worked tirelessly, moving from one position to the next, fine-tuning defenses and giving instructions. Ben helped set up a communications network using old radios and walkie-talkies. If they come, we'll know, he told Ella. They'll come, Ella said. It's just a matter of when. That when came at midnight. Hector's forces moved in like a storm, SUVs roaring down the streets and armed enforcers fanning out into the neighborhood. At the first barricade, a group of residents stood their ground. Hector's men sneered as they approached, expecting easy compliance. Instead, the residents activated a series of traps. Nets dropped from above, tires were slashed by hidden spikes, and smoke bombs filled the air. Chaos erupted as Hector's men scrambled, disoriented and unprepared. From her command post in the bookstore, Ella coordinated the defense. Barricade 3, fall back to the second line. Keep them guessing. Got it. Maria's voice crackled over the radio. Ben sat nearby, monitoring the feeds from the security cameras he'd hacked. They're splitting up, trying to flank us, he reported. Good, Ella replied. Let them overextend. As the battle spread through the streets, Ella moved like a ghost, striking where the enemy least expected. At one point, she intercepted a group attempting to breach a safe house. With precise strikes and non-lethal takedowns, she neutralized them before they could reach the door. Meanwhile, Hector prowled through the chaos, his frustration mounting. Where is she? He barked into his radio. She's everywhere. One of his men shouted back, panic evident in his voice. The tide began to turn as Ella's tactics outmaneuvered Hector's brute force. His men, accustomed to intimidation and firepower, couldn't adapt to the traps and guerrilla strategies the community employed. But then, Hector revealed his trump card. From the back of an armored SUV, a team of heavily armed mercenaries emerged. These weren't street thugs. They were professionals, brought in to finish what Diego had started. They're moving toward the school, Ben reported, his voice tense. That's where the last group of evacuees is hiding. Ella's stomach dropped. The school was supposed to be the safest location, a fallback point for families who couldn't make it to the safe houses. Stay here, Ella told Ben, grabbing her gear. Mom, wait. No arguments, Ella said firmly. Keep coordinating. I'll handle this. At the school, Hector's mercenaries breached the gates, their movements efficient and lethal. Families huddled in the gymnasium, their fear palpable. Ella arrived just as the mercenaries were preparing to storm the building. She assessed the situation quickly. 8 targets, heavily armed, but spread out. Using the cover of darkness, she moved silently, taking down the outer guards first. A flashbang grenade disoriented the remaining mercenaries, giving her the opening she needed. One by one, they fell to her precision strikes. Hector arrived just as Ella neutralized the last mercenary. Wraith, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Hector, she replied, her tone ice-cold. This ends now, he growled, raising his weapon. No, Ella said, stepping closer, her pistol trained on him. It ended the moment you came after my family. Hector hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. You're done, Ella continued. Your men are scattered, your resources are gone, and the police are closing in. It's over. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Hector's grip on his weapon faltered, and Ella seized the moment. With a swift move, she disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. By the time the authorities arrived, the neighborhood was battered but standing strong. Hector was hauled away in handcuffs, his reign of terror finally at an end. As the first rays of dawn broke over Miami, Ella stood with Ben on the steps of the bookstore. We did it, Ben said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Ella nodded, though her expression was pensive. We won this battle, but the fight's never really over. Ben looked at her, determination shining in his eyes. Then we'll keep fighting. Together. Ella smiled, pulling him into a hug. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the community she had come to love and protect. The days following Hector Ruiz's capture brought a cautious calm to the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, residents felt safe enough to step outside without looking over their shoulders. Shops reopened, children played in the streets, and a tentative sense of normalcy began to return. Ella Morgan stood outside her bookstore, watching his neighbors work together to repair the damage left in the wake of Hector's siege. Boards were pulled from windows, debris was cleared from streets, and conversations were filled with relief rather than fear. Feels different, doesn't it? Maria said, approaching Ella with 2 cups of coffee. Ella accepted one with a small smile. It does. People are starting to believe they can take back what's theirs. Maria nodded, her expression serious. Because of you. You gave us the courage to fight. I just reminded them of what they were capable of, Ella replied. Inside the bookstore, Ben was hard at work organizing the surveillance files they had gathered over the past few weeks. His laptop hummed as he uploaded key pieces of evidence to a secure server, ensuring that Hector's network couldn't regroup. You're becoming quite the tech wizard, Ella said, stepping in and placing a hand on his shoulder. Ben grinned. I had a good teacher. Ella's smile faded slightly. You did more than I ever wanted you to. I didn't want this life for you, Ben. Mom, Ben said, meeting her eyes. I know, but I wouldn't change it. We did something that mattered. We saved people. Ella nodded, her pride tempered by the knowledge of the risks they'd taken. We did. But now we have to make sure it stays that way. At the sheriff's office, Arthur Hayes sat across from Ella, his desk cluttered with reports and case files. You really shook the hornet's nest, Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. Is the hive gone? Ella asked. Arthur sighed. Hector's locked up, and with the evidence you provided, we've already started dismantling his network. But it's not just local. It's connected to bigger players outside the city. Ella's expression hardened. Then you can't stop here. If you don't root them out completely, they'll rebuild. We're doing what we can, Arthur said. But corruption runs deep, and resources are limited. Ella leaned forward, her voice firm. Then let me help. I know how these organizations work, how they think. If you give me access, I can do what needs to be done. Arthur studied her for a long moment. You're not just a bookstore owner, are you? No, Ella admitted. I'm someone who's been fighting people like Hector for a long time, and I'm not done yet. That evening, Ella gathered the community leaders at the bakery, now fully repaired and bustling with activity. Maria, Tom, Kate Sullivan, and a handful of others sat around a table, their faces a mix of gratitude and determination. We've won a battle, but the war isn't over, Ella began, her voice steady and commanding. Hector was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If we want to protect our neighborhood, we need to stay vigilant. Tom crossed his arms. You're saying we need to keep fighting? I'm saying we need to be prepared, Ella replied. Hector's network is crumbling, but there are others who will try to take his place. We have to send a message that this community isn't an easy target. Maria nodded. We stand together, just like before. Ella looked around the table, seeing the resolve in their eyes. Exactly. And with Arthur's help, we can make sure the authorities stay on our side. As the meeting ended and the group dispersed, Ella walked home with Ben, the moonlight casting long shadows on the quiet streets. Do you think it's really over? Ben asked, his voice soft. Not yet, Ella said, but we've taken the first step. And now, people know they don't have to be afraid. Ben glanced at her. What about you? Are you going to keep doing this? Ella hesitated, the weight of his question pressing on her. I don't know. I left that life behind for a reason. But if it means keeping you and this neighborhood safe, you'll do it, Ben finished for her. She nodded. I'll do it. The next day brought unexpected visitors. 2 men in suits arrived at the bookstore, their demeanor professional, but their intentions unclear. Ms. Morgan, one of them said, flashing a badge. Agent Walker, FBI. This is Agent Mills. We'd like to speak with you. Ella's pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm. What's this about? Agent Walker exchanged a glance with his partner. Hector Ruiz's arrest has created ripples in some very dangerous circles. Your involvement has not gone unnoticed. Ella crossed her arms. And, Walker continued, we could use someone with your skill set to help us finish what you started. Ella studied them, her mind racing. I'm not interested in going back to that life. Mills spoke up. We're not asking you to rejoin the agency. But the intel you've gathered could help us take down a major cartel. If you don't want to be involved directly, at least give us access to your files. Ella glanced at Ben, who had been listening from behind the counter. He gave her a small nod, his expression supportive. Fine, Ella said. You'll get the files. But if I hear you've compromised this neighborhood, we're done. Understood, Walker said, his tone respectful. Thank you, Ms. Morgan. That night, Ella and Ben sat on the bookstore's rooftop, looking out over the city. You think they'll actually make a difference? Ben asked. Ella shrugged. I don't know, but if they don't, we'll be ready. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of both the dangers and the resilience of the world they lived in. As the night deepened, Ella felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The battle wasn't over, but for now, they had one. And as long as they stood together, Ella knew they could face whatever came next. A week after Hector Ruiz's arrest, the neighborhood was thriving in a way it hadn't in years. The boarded-up windows and lingering fear had been replaced by bustling businesses, laughter in the streets, and a renewed sense of unity. Ella Morgan sat at her bookstore counter, watching as Ben chatted with a group of teenagers about a coding workshop he was organizing. He'd taken his role in their fight and transformed it into something constructive, something that could inspire others. You're really leaning into this whole tech mentor thing, Ella teased as Ben joined her at the counter. Ben shrugged, grinning. If it helps kids stay out of trouble, why not? Ella nodded, her heart swelling with pride. You're making a difference, Ben. So are you, he replied. Ella smiled, but her expression was tinged with the weight of all they'd been through. We did it together. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Arthur Hayes stopped by the bookstore. Thought you might want to see this, he said, handing Ella a file. Inside were pages of reports detailing the dismantling of Hector's network. Several of his lieutenants had been arrested, his finances frozen, and the FBI was actively pursuing his international connections. You've done a lot of good here, Ella, Arthur said. Ella glanced at the file, then back at him. We've done a lot of good. This community stood up for itself. That's what matters. Arthur nodded. Still, without you, none of this would have been possible. Ella's smile was faint but genuine. I just reminded people of their own strength. That evening, Ella walked through the neighborhood, taking in the changes. She passed Maria's flower shop, now flourishing with colorful blooms in the window. Tom Bennett waved to her from his bakery, a tray of fresh bread in his hands. As she approached the community center, she found Kate Sullivan organizing a town hall meeting. The room buzzed with energy as residents discussed plans for neighborhood improvements, safety initiatives, and local events. Ella stayed in the back, content to watch. For the first time in years, she felt like she'd truly come home. Back at the bookstore, Ella found Ben tinkering with a small drone at the dining table. "What's this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just a project," Ben said, holding it up. "Thought we could use it for surveillance. You know, in case someone tries something again." Ella chuckled, ruffling his hair. Always thinking ahead. Ben smiled but then grew serious. "Do you think we're really safe now?" Ella sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "Safe isn't a guarantee, but we've shown we won't back down. That's what makes the difference."